Welcome to Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan, joined and flanked always by my main man, Mr. David Seaton. How are you today, sir?
What's going on, man? Another crazy week.
We had a crazy Friday.
It's been at least 3 or 4 consecutive Fridays for the Trump administration.
Oh my goodness. There's so much going on this week. We thank you guys. Hello, Facebook Live family. We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you to all our listeners on Intellectual Radio, YouTube, whatever medium you are using. We thank you for your time today, and we definitely won't waste it. We appreciate it. So we're going to jump right into this. We got a lot to cover today, Dave, as always. Time is against us, my friend. We've got to talk about the latest in presidential politics. We've got to talk about the president's comments on Afghanistan, and certainly the firing of Mr. Gorka yesterday.
Sebastian Gorka.
Right.
Man.
I hate that we didn't get a clip of some of his best ofs. We should have gotten some for today. That would have been great. But we also have to talk about the transgender ban that Trump signed yet again, that he keeps pushing. We keep getting 2 conflicting messages. We're going to talk about it in 6 months, and then he does something more immediate. So I feel sorry for those people, the people that are already in the military, not being able to know what is going on, to hit them with that much confusion. I just can't even imagine. So we got to talk about that a little bit. And what else happened yesterday? He pardoned Sheriff.
Pardoning of Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
And that's where we're going to spend a good little while talking about that, because I really want to highlight the atrocities of the sheriff and understand the context of the man that he pardoned without serving a day in jail.
That's the best word for it.
Right. We're going to talk about that today, too. Joining us today for that conversation will be Chicago columnist Monroe Anderson. You guys in Chicago know him. He's been a staple here in Chicago for years and many years. So he's joining us today. We're very grateful for that. And later we're going to have a conversation. You definitely don't want to miss this one. We're going to have a conversation basically about hope, about the realistic hope of the Black community in America, and the dreams and aspirations of America. And is it a fallacy? Is it a false hope to really believe that one day we'll all be equal? We've got an excellent guest for that later this afternoon. He's written an amazing piece. We'll tell you more about it later in the show, but he's of the mindset that we might have to deal with the reality that it might be hopeless.
I agree.
and we would love your input on that. So feel free to one, share the video, and feel free to comment as much as possible. We'd love to read your comments in real time and get them answered by a wonderful qualified guest. And we just thank you again for your support on Humanity in the Headlines. We will be right back after this break. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, I am Atiba Buchanan, joined by Mr. David Seaton. And joining us right now is Chicago columnist, and TV personality, homegrown Monroe Anderson. How are you today, sir?
Oh, I'm good. What about you guys?
We are excellent. Loving this late fall or this late summer weather.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. This is like my little spot right here. You know, the high 70s. This, it's not too hot, not too cool. This is kind of where I like it. So I'm in a good mood today.
Yeah, no, it is beautiful weather.
Absolutely.
It's sort of like San Francisco weather.
Exactly. So we are glad you are here with us today, sir, to kind of help us unpack the last dizzying 24 hours, let alone the events of the last week.
Oh, I know. No, this is a mad roller coaster ride.
Absolutely.
You don't know when it's going to jump off the rails.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the way you put it, because this is a roller coaster that you've never been on. you don't know what to expect.
Right.
So with that said, let's talk about probably the most notable thing, and that is the pardoning of Sheriff Joe Arpaio out of Arizona. What were your initial thoughts when you heard him, one, intimate earlier in the week that he was going to do it, and then to see him execute it so quickly within the week without it being reviewed by the Justice Department, without him ever serving a day in jail? How did that impact you?
Oh, Trump has no regard for the law. That's how it strikes me.
That's a great way to put it. He has absolutely no regard for the Constitution.
Its purpose. Hold on 1 second. I think my phone's about to die. I'm switching over on you.
No
okay?
problem.
But give me like 10 seconds.
Take your time.
Okay.
While he's switching phones, I'm forced to think out loud, and maybe he can answer this for us. But my thought is Trump flagrantly disregarding the Constitution, or is this just a function of his ignorance of the Constitution?
No, it's not ignorance. Trump has disregarded the laws since the 80s. This is nothing new. His perspective on laws are how they can benefit him or he can get around them. He has no, and it's gonna come back to bite him like it did with Blagojevich. Because if you remember Blago, the judges kept telling him, don't, go on all these shows talking about how you're innocent and trying to poison the
jury pool.
And he ignored them. And so when it came time for the sentencing, he got way more time than he would have gotten if he had behaved better.
Yeah, but the first thing that comes to mind isn't the president's power in this situation absolute? There really is nothing we can do about it, right?
No, nothing.
Right.
Nothing.
And even when I don't want to veer too far off, but Donald Trump isn't unique in the pantheon of rich, powerful elites who look for loopholes in the law and try to play the law to their advantage. That's probably the most charitable interpretation that I could give Donald Trump.
No, that is, but he's done it all his life as a real estate person. He has so many lawsuits out there.
Right.
Where either he's suing somebody or they're suing him. Because he doesn't pay his bills, he cheats people. If they insult him or upset him, that he sues them. He just, to him it's just the law is a plaything.
Yeah, and that's
no respect for it. He has no respect for judges, as you noticed when he was attacking if you remember, when he was attacking the Hispanic judge.
Judge Curiel, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, he just... And the other thing, now, here's another theory that I think we should discuss, and that's that he pardoned Arpaio as a test.
Right. He tested
for pardoning his family and friends on the whole Russian and Mueller investigation.
Right, and that's really what the pundits are out there saying, is that this is Trump sending a wink and a nod to all of his co-conspirators, end quote.
Right.
That, hey, don't worry about it, because if you get jammed up, if it comes down to it, I've got this pardon power in my back pocket, and you'll be okay.
Yeah, except that it's not. Because he always half knows stuff.
Right.
And so the thing that he may not be fully aware of is that in pardoning, say, Flynn, then Flynn doesn't have the protection
of the Fifth Amendment.
The Fifth
Right. Right. That was the next thing I was going to say.
Then Flynn goes before the grand jury and lies. They can send him to jail on that, unless Trump is willing to pardon him again.
Right.
And at some point, if Trump just goes too wild on this, then the spineless Republican Congress are going to do what needs to be done, and that's impeach him.
But it's kind of counterintuitive, but Donald Trump has actually kind of put himself in a double trap, because if he pardons the individuals who he thinks might have information that could ultimately get him impeached.
No, but he knows. Wait, not might. He knows. This is what you have to think about. Trump knows what he did wrong. He knows exactly what he did wrong, and he's talked to his lawyers, and so he knows exactly where they're going to get him if he can't outmaneuver it.
Right, so, but my point is,
he knows what they did wrong.
Right, but my point is that if he goes out and he pardons everyone who's involved and who's in his orbit, who have knowledge of his wrongdoing, if he pardons enough people, he's strengthening the obstruction of justice case against him by Mueller. So he's in a catch-22.
Right. No, you're 100% right on that. And that was my earlier reference to the spineless Congress finally getting around to doing what they should be doing, the Republican Congress.
So this is Atiba again. What I'd like to do is actually address the elephant in the room as it pertains to the sheriff's pardon. That what he actually did too was pardon a racist, and that there was a wink and a nod
but Trump
to all of them as well.
So they're in the same club. In fact, they're two old white men of the same mentality.
Exactly.
Arpaio is a snowbird. He left Pennsylvania to go to the war, but brought all his racist attitudes with him there. So Trump has been what Trump has been since he was discriminating against black people in renting of apartments back in the 80s.
Exactly.
So these, and Trump's daddy was arrested at a Nazi riot back in 1927. So this goes way back.
Exactly. He's always showing us who he is, but we've had these arguments over the past 18 months in particular, while he's been running for president, and now that he's become president, right. People will say with a straight face, well, what proof do you have that he's racist? So let's talk about this sheriff for a second, because what he went to jail for, he hasn't served a day. What he was charged with was basically violating the constitutional rights of Hispanics in Arizona, because he had a rule that his officers could go out and anyone that they thought didn't have papers, they could stop and harass and ask them for papers. And the problem is, you can only do that based on a visual cue of them being Hispanic, which is a violation of the Constitution.
Exactly, and they were Hispanic Americans in most instances.
Exactly, and that was the point I wanted to bring up.
Who just happened to be Hispanic.
Exactly, because in Trump's even in Trump's tweet about pardoning the sheriff, he said he kept us safe, and for a lot of people, they do not care about the constitutional civil rights of people as long as it's framed in it's in my safety. It's in the best interest of the safety of whomever.
But that's a head fake. The reality is that not all of Trump's supporters are racist, and not all of Trump's supporters, this is a white backlash. Exactly. What they're really upset about is that in 20 years, it's not going to be a majority white country anymore. It's going to be a majority brown country. And they don't like that. And they're fighting against it every which way they can. But it's like the Hurricane Harvey that's going on now. It's nothing you can do about it. It's, the wind is blowing and the rain is falling.
Exactly. Yeah, we're dealing with the inevitable. Go ahead, Dave. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Not at all. Again, this is David Seaton, Mr. Anderson. Let me get your opinion on the long view. I'm going to say what I think, and then I want you to comment.
Okay.
the far more dangerous impact of what Donald Trump has done, it really has really less to do with Sheriff Arpaio.
Yeah.
We have a system here that we elect people who are in the executive branch. We elect people who are in the legislative branch. And then the people in the judicial branch are appointed, and they're supposed to be impartial. So the last vestige of hope that we have as American citizens is that when the law fails us and the executive branch fails to enforce those laws, the last best hope that we have as American citizens is getting the judicial branch to rule on what is fair and what is just and what is lawful.
Yeah.
If we don't have the refuge of the judicial branch, there's no place else to go.
No, there isn't. There isn't. But the system is holding up. You know, Trump is not going to win in the judicial branch. He's trying to discredit it every which way he can. He has no respect for it whatsoever. He only thinks of it in terms of how it could benefit him. But the thing is, there are people, you know, for example, Mueller's 16 lawyers he has now. There are superstars, investigators, who specialize in white-collar fraud. White-collar crime, sorry. And what they're looking into is Trump, you know, following the dollar. And they're going to get him on that. They're going to get him on that, him and his people. They will. Now,
and I would be inclined to agree with you.
I mean, we obviously we don't have crystal balls, so we can't say for sure. But once the truth is out, then the most spineless Republicans are going to have to deal with that, because if not, it's the end of America as we know it.
And I'm glad you said that, because ultimately the ultimate test is not the pardoning of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. It's
Right.
not going to be the other police officers and police forces who are emboldened throughout the country by seeing Jeff Arpaio being pardoned.
Exactly.
The looming constitutional crises
Right.
that is going to happen is that if Donald Trump is impeached, if he tries to pardon himself.
Right. Well, he cannot pardon himself, but period. You know, I mean, that's not even a question. But what he can do is pardon everybody who could testify against him. And then if they are held in contempt, or if they're found to have perjured themselves, he can re-pardon them. He can pardon them for the perjury. He can keep pardoning them. But the thing is, I can't imagine that holding up, where at some point the Republican Congress will say, okay, this is enough of this.
Well, I think that's the thing that concerns me, Mr. Anderson, is the Congress, because at this point there's been plenty of information that has come out for them to justify walking away from him. But as David and I were talking about this before, is that, you know, they're in a unique situation. They've got a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a supposedly Republican president. And I think at this point they are just trying to hold on as long as they can to get as much of their agenda through as possible while they're in this unique situation.
No, you're absolutely right. However, the problem is they haven't done anything.
Exactly.
They have not, except for the SCOTUS appointment. You know, getting the guy on the Supreme Court.
Right.
They have not accomplished anything. I mean, Trump, through executive order, has undone a lot of things that Obama put into place. But they haven't accomplished any of the stuff that they ran on or they promised to do. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We're going in September. Next month, they're going to have a huge, nasty fight over the budget ceiling. It's going to tie them up. And so basically, when they go into 2018, nobody's going to have, among the Republicans, anything to run on the great accomplishments they did when Trump was in office.
But ultimately, do you think that's going to result in the flipping of seats?
Yeah, I think they're going to lose.
So you think there's going to be a Democratic majority in 2018?
The Republicans are going to lose the House.
Okay.
But let me give you another interesting theory that I heard somebody on MSNBC talk about, is that Trump is divorcing himself from the Republican Party, the leaders and what have you, because what he plans to do in 2020 is run as an independent. Because he has that 35% hardcore support.
Yes.
And that's it. You know, he's not getting any more than that. He's not trying to get any more than that. He's got these fools that, you know, if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, they'd forgive him.
Right, which is huge for an independent candidate.
As an independent, the Republicans run Ryan or somebody, you know, whoever, as their candidate. The Democrats have theirs, so the vote gets split 3 ways, and with 35%, Trump can win again as an independent president.
Mr. Anderson, again, this is David Seaton, and I want to bring it back just to Sheriff Joe Arpaio just for 1 second.
Sorry for veering off.
No, not at all.
Problem.
But here's my fear. I mean, we do stories all the time here on Humanity in the Headlines about police abuses throughout the country. We were actually we were going to talk about the story about how 900,000 convictions got or people got released for lack of evidence in New York shortly after the inauguration of this president.
Yeah.
My fear is that these people, I mean, the police are already out of control. They're already killing citizens indiscriminately. They're already behaving as judge, jury, and executioner on the streets of America.
Right.
My fear is they're going to become even more emboldened now that they've seen Sheriff Joe Arpaio get a pardon from the president.
Maybe. We'll have to see what type of protest occur. You know, the reason they did the hurricane dump on all this, you know, last night, but so it would all get lost in the coverage of the hurricane. But the hurricanes will last 3 or 4 more days for the most part, and then we'll be back to the real news, and we'll see if resist goes to the streets on this or not.
Well, we appreciate you joining us today, Mr. Anderson. Please tell our listeners and our watchers and everyone how they can follow you on social media or where they can find you online.
My Twitter handle is Monroe Anderson. My Facebook page is Monroe Anderson. I have 5,000 friends, so it's going to be hard.
It's kind of full, right?
to get to people. But I'm at the limit. But you can follow me on Facebook, and I have 1,200 and some followers, so they could join that. And I have a blog that I haven't paid much attention to, but it's again, just Google me, Monroe Anderson. You can find me.
There it is.
Okay,
well,
and I really love talking to you guys.
We love talking to you more.
It's nice talking to some young, intelligent, informed black men. I really love talking to you.
That's a superlative comment, and we appreciate you representing the same best of our community as well.
Okay, all right. You have a good day, okay?
Same to you, sir. Thank you.
Have a great one.
Sure.
Girl, you got to say that for the promo.
I think I'm already friends with Monroe Anderson.
I think so. Because he's been on the show before.
Right.
So I think we made that.
Right. Yeah, because he's a cyber columnist at Chicago, Illinois,
Yes.
former op-ed page. So if you're looking for him on Facebook, just type in Monroe Anderson, and he's the first one that pops up.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate his insight today. That was wonderful. We're going to take a quick break. You do not want to miss the next conversation. We speak to Professor Donald Earl Collins from the University of Maryland. He's a history professor, and he's going to talk about Black hope or the lack thereof. You don't want to miss that. Thank you for listening to Humanity in the Headlines. We will be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, this is Atiba Buchanan, joined by Mr. David Seaton, and we're going to keep it going today. We have with us right now Professor Donald Earl Collins. I like that you use your middle name. I love that. He is a associate professor of history at the University of Maryland University College. How are you this afternoon, sir?
I'm fine. Thank you for asking. How are you?
We are excellent on today. The weather's lovely here in Chicago, and things are going great. So we're going to jump right into it because you wrote a very powerful piece this week on Al Jazeera, and it's titled "Have Black Historians Been Wrong All Along?" with the subtitle "With American Racism and Black History, There Are No Happy Endings." I would like to, thank you for writing the piece from the perspective that you did. We're going to get into that in a moment. What I'd like to do is really just jump right into the top of the piece and then ask you a question. In the very first paragraph, you say that for all the examples of African American success and American racism reduced, Blacks are as far away from the quote unquote promised land as their great-great-grandparents were 150 years ago. That one kind of made me take a pause to think about the gravity of that statement. If you could expound on that a little bit for our listeners.
Sure. What I was thinking of really was my great-great-grandmother, who was born 2 years after the end of slavery in 1867. And what I was thinking about specifically along those lines is, what was life like for her and for the millions of freed African Americans who had finally been granted their freedom, their citizenship rights, and in the case of Black males, their voting rights between 1865 and 1870, so about 150 years ago. And yet, with all of that, they still face violence from white supremacists. They still face the prospect of losing whatever they have materially. They still have to worry about their bodies being maimed through violence. They still have to worry about the prospect of eking out a living in which they have few, if any, rights that they could actually exercise. All of those sorts of things that white Americans, quite frankly, take for granted in terms of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the freedom that just exists, actually. Those are the kinds of things I was thinking about. And when I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about Martin Luther King and his speeches about talking about going to the promised land and that he might not be there with us. His final speech essentially talks about that the day before he's assassinated by James Earl Ray. So all of those things went into that one sentence. Those are the idea that, you know, for everything, for the fact that there are more African Americans in the middle class, that there are more African Americans who are going to college, there are more African Americans who, well, quite frankly, we don't have to worry about Jim Crow laws anymore, but we still have police brutality to worry about, right? So that's what went into that paragraph, into that sentence and that paragraph.
Wow. So basically what I'm hearing from you, and I've made this point a few times myself, is that basically, and you let me know if this is not, if this characterization is right of what I'm hearing from you, but it sounds like that one of the best things that white supremacy is good at is evolving. So regardless of how we think we've made progress, when you actually look at the things that are quantifiable and measurable, nothing really changes. Is that about right? Because of white supremacy's ability to evolve from slavery to Jim Crow to the mass incarceration system, and whatever it is, no matter what we think we've done, there's been an evolution in white supremacy that materially deletes a lot of what we think is progress.
That's more or less right. I would just add that it's not so much that it evolved, although definitely more. I will say that's for sure. But it's also the fact that there are layers to this thing. It's not just
it's levels to this.
It's not just hatred or individuals who want to exercise hate. It's about exercising power ultimately. White supremacy is about the exercising of power, and that power is translated in policy usually. And so if slavery ends, but you have that little sort of addendum in the 13th Amendment that allows for people to be forced into labor during prison, then the logical thing would be to imprison as many African Americans as possible so that you can use them as free labor in that sense, just as one example. So it's not so much that supremacy evolved, but the use of policy to continue institutional structural racism on such a level that it never seems to really go away.
I'm listening to you speak. This is David Seaton again, and thank you for joining us today. I'm listening to you speak, and I find it ironic that you are a professor of history, and I immediately thought of that old statement that says those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Is what we're experiencing right now under Donald Trump and under a Donald Trump presidency, is it really just an ignorance of history? I mean, and I mean, we have people that can't remember from election to election, let alone 150 years ago.
I would say that, I mean, Trump is basically the embodiment of the kinds of presidents we used to have, the kinds of presidents who are openly racist, openly sexist, openly xenophobic, and so on. The kinds of presidents that we had, like Woodrow Wilson, or like a James Buchanan or an Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. So historically, if you're thinking about presidents, Trump really is just the embodiment and culmination of the things that people who feel like that they have lost out in American society voted for, right? And, you know, the newspapers have spent a lot of time, mainstream media has spent a lot of time talking about how rural whites and working class whites and poor whites and the Rust Belt have lost out as a result of the changes in our society, completely forgetting that these same trends have also affected poor African Americans, poor Latinos, middle class African Americans who live in the Rust Belt, and so on and so forth. So there's this sort of there are two realities: the reality that we all live in, where everyone's been affected, and the reality that whites who feel like that they're losing strength and power live in, which is the one where they feel like they've been more victimized in other groups as a result of these changes. And Trump represents the embodiment of what to do about it.
Right, and even as I listen to you say that, and that you talk about he's really just a resurgence of Woodrow Wilson, I would posit that it even goes further than that. When you hear people, especially people on the right, when they talk about the founding fathers, they always deify them like they were these sages, they were these wise men who struck out on their own to come to the new world to create this beautifully written constitution that was handed down to them by God. But again, and that's why I go to the ignorance of history. When you look at the Constitution that was written in this country, it's really just a souped up version or a modernized version of the Magna Carta. When you look at slavery as an institution, if you go back 200 or 150 years in human history before mechanization, we had to use manual human labor to get things done. The difference in slavery in this country is that it was chattel slavery, and that we treated black people as property and as we weren't even considered to be human. So that kind of touches back to what Atiba was saying, that the evolution of the caricature of black people to keep us subjugated is so it's ubiquitous, and it's independent of time.
Absolutely. It's the one thing that if you look at the absolute root of American society, or you dig down 400 years, dig down to the very foundation of society, it was about the use of labor use of free labor in order to gain wealth, right? That's what the white guys from England came over here in 1607 to do, was to find gold. And short of finding gold, they figured out the cash crop, and then they tried to enslave the Indians. And when the Indians died off due to disease, then they enslaved Africans. That's how this whole system has worked, and it's been that way for 400 years. And yes, you are right in saying that that people don't understand their history. They don't want to understand history. They live in their day-to-day reality, and the result being that anybody that comes to you with an approach that says, let's look at this long term, let's take this panoramic view of what's really going on in our society, it becomes almost unacceptable to them to really try to confront that history and deal with it in any sort of way. And that's part of the reason why, quite frankly, just even dealing with individual racism is hard to deal with. Forget about structural and institutional racism. Just getting individuals to recognize their own isms is difficult, almost impossible in some cases.
This is a team. I'd like to defer back to the piece that you wrote for just a moment. You say here, I have never doubted the strength, courage, and faith of Blacks in surviving and succeeding, despite America's virulent racial and sexual oppression. But as Washington, D.C. public historian Myra McWhorter told me, historians like me have been too deeply ensconced in the American dream and have cared too much about individual progress and not enough about white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. So the reason I bring that particular passage up is to say that, what about because a lot of the times, like when you look at Colin Kaepernick, there are a lot of people that feel like because he's individually rich, he could not possibly feel a certain way about oppression. They'll say, what is oppressed about his life?
Right.
So my question to you is, have we been too swayed by the Barack Obamas, by the Oprah Winfreys, by the Michael Jordans of the world, to then how have those things caused us to miss the bigger picture?
It's simple. The American dream is extremely attractive. It's really attractive. The American dream isn't just owning a house and a white picket fence and 2.2 kids and a dog and a car or two. It's about ultimately becoming rich. And when you hold out these examples in popular culture and politics, like Obama, like Colin Kaepernick, like Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jordan, and probably any number of 2 or 3 million other people you could name, of people of color you can name, the fact is that becomes the mantelpiece by which all of us, at least because of our conditioning and living in this society, believe that's sort of supposed to strive for. When the reality is, Colin Kaepernick's life, Barack Obama's life, Oprah Winfrey's life took a whole bunch of unique, in some cases really lucky turns in order for them to turn out the way they did.
Right.
Right. They had talent. Other people noticed it. They came from a pretty unique background in a couple of cases, etc. But on the aggregate, if you look at African American life in terms of the socioeconomic,
there we go.
We're disproportionately in poverty.
There you go.
If you look at it in terms of health, Black men don't live past, barely make it to collect a Social Security check. I mean, those are the kinds of things that you have to look at in the aggregate. And so, the American dream isn't a dream for, I would say, the vast majority of people of color living in this country. Not when you can walk out the door and get shot on any given day.
And get no justice.
And by white supremacists. No.
And get no justice.
I often, when I hear the word American dream, and I've been thinking, I've heard that phrase since I was a child. It always struck me very early in life that you have to be asleep to have a dream. having said that, having said that, let me go macro for a minute. In any society, everyone can't be rich. if everyone is rich, then no one is rich. The very definition of being rich means that you have more wealth, or you have more material wealth, or you have more money than the average person.
Right.
So is that something that we should even, is that the thing that we need to address in our struggle? That have we, although being able to participate in the socioeconomics of the society in which we exist is just a very basic key that one needs in order to exist. But I often think back to Martin Luther King. He said, hey, if you're going to be a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper you can be. Now, obviously, that's a little arcane and perhaps even anachronistic based on the fact that we're in the 21st century and we live in a technology society. But have we as African Americans become victims of striving to be the best with socioeconomics and all of the perhaps immorality that requires?
I would say that there's a mixed answer to that question. It's not simple yes or no. I would say that if you think about the fact that we live in a society where everyone believes essentially that they can become rich. You're also talking about society that, quite frankly, you have to be a little bit narcissistic to actually believe that. You have to have a little bit of narcissism in you to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and gain some wealth here, right? So, I mean, so in that sense, if you are really trying to do all of those things, yeah, I mean, it's problematic. But at the same time, I would say this too, that if the goal really is to try to assimilate American society while trying to maintain some unique blackness simultaneously, those are tensions that can't be, especially within the context of American racism, that can't really truly exist side by side. And the reason I say that is that in order to be successful as an African American, as a Latino, as a person of color in general in this society, in order to become rich, you kind of have to accept all the ills that come with capitalism. You have to accept all of those ills and be willing to essentially partake in oppression in the process of becoming rich. Because essentially, in order for you to be rich, someone has to be poor.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Which is your point. So, yeah, so in that sense, that's why it's problematic. It's not problematic unto itself. It's perfectly fine to want to prosper.
Right.
But the problem becomes when everyone realizes, when you have a society that built this in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender, that's the end result when you prosper that way.
Right. And I guess my ultimate point is because we oftentimes talk about, we're a progressive, left-leaning political show for the most part. So I think the danger in when we say that a disproportionate number of African Americans don't have access to wealth or don't have access to socioeconomics, and that there are systemic barriers out there that prevent us from having access. When you say that, it's very easy to forget that most of the people in this country who are poor are white. Most of the people in this country who are on welfare are white. And so again, I guess it's kind of a double-edged sword in that certainly I believe that we need to have more access to capital and socioeconomics as a group of people, but I think the only way that we're going to progress politically and the only way that we're going to drive out the Trumps of the world is if that we as African Americans openly admit and join forces with the poor white people who are out there, who, quite frankly, there are more poor white people in America than there are black people.
Absolutely. But I would go a step further and also say that if we're going to join forces with these folks, it would mean that somebody's enlightened these folks, meaning other white people, progressive white folks who understand their own privilege, who understand racism in the context of the African American struggle to be part of this society as equals and so on. You need those kinds of people going into poor white communities, working with poor white students and working in political context and educational context and other contexts to bring up in order to wake them up so
Sure.
that they're at least awakened on some levels in order to work with African Americans. There have been several movements throughout American history in which poor white and poor African Americans have attempted to join forces to deal with issues regarding class.
Sure.
And those efforts, whether it was in the 1890s or the 1930s or even the 1950s and 60s, usually fail because the power of racism on both the individual level and on the structural and institutional level is strong enough to dissuade them from working with African Americans in large numbers. In order to counteract that, it's not that African Americans have to go into these communities. White folks need to go to these communities and start talking to their own folks about these sorts of issues and about how to overcome their own individual prejudice and to recognize that the matrix has a hold over them too. The world's pulled over their eyes just as much as it's been pulled over their own eyes.
Exactly.
So Professor Collins, as we bring this segment to a close, let me ask you this, and I'd like to defer back to what we started the conversation with when we talked about the quote unquote promised land. What is that?
I think the promised land isn't America as we know it. I think the promised land ultimately is a country that is not the USA as we know it today. It can't be an imperial country. It can't be a country that believes in unbridled capitalism. It can't be a country where everyone thinks that they're going to be rich. And it certainly can't be a country where certain classes of people should just always be inferior to other classes of people. If all those things change, we have our promised land, but it's not America. It's something else.
So my question to you then, as the point of the article, is that my question to you is, should Black people be hopeful to achieve that one day, or is that being naive at this point?
It's naive. I think what we should be doing is trying to blunt and ameliorate and limit the impact that racism has on folks of color and deal with all the other isms as well. We should resist. We should, strive for some incremental changes here and there. But I don't think ultimately you're going to bring down the structures of the society in a way that still maintains America as America while simultaneously going for this promised land.
So in other words, keep up the good fight, recognizing that there will always be a good fight.
For better and for worse. Professor Collins, we've got to have you come back and do a part 2 of this, because I could have this conversation with you. I could have this conversation with you for hours, but since we're at the end of our show, again, we really appreciate you coming on today and having this conversation. Please tell our listeners and our followers how they can get in touch with you or how they can find you in social media, where you are.
Sure. The easiest way to get in touch with me is on Twitter at D.E. Collins 1969. The D for Donald, the E for Earl, and just as an aside, the Earl's for Earl to Pearl Monroe, which makes it easier for people to find me than just go to Donald Collins. So there you go. Having me on, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it was a very compelling piece. We just had to bring you on the show and get that perspective out. I'm sure our listeners greatly appreciate it. We thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Take care.
Sure.
So we're close to the end of the show, but we got a minute or two left. I want to play a little bit of sound for our listeners because we want to acknowledge something that happened this week. Just going to play a minute and let the listeners appreciate it.
Now, let me say this. All we said here, what needs to be said, we think an illegitimate child is a child that don't know where their daddy is. America is an illegitimate child because she has no mother. And this is what the problem is. If I work in a coal mine, in a steel mill, and I come here today and put on a suit but don't take a bath, you got stink sitting up here with you. And what has happened to America, we ain't never cleaned up the filth over 400 years. We just put a new suit on and a new dress on and then wonder who's stinking. It's you the one that's stinking. That's what this is. And until we clean this out, until we clean it up, my mama used to grab me and wash my face America ain't got no mama that's washing her face. She'd pick my nose when it need to be opened up. She'd look in my ears. All we do is we went from this filth we was in to putting on some new clothes, and nobody has said, hey, somewhere we got to apologize. First, the black women. White women's okay, but that black woman went through racist white system and sexist black meat. And we ain't never said what you've been through. And in spite of that, look at that black woman. Look at Kathy Hughes. She didn't have the privilege of a ladies' movement when she.
All right, we're going to leave it there.
Dick Gregory.
Right, we just want to acknowledge the passing of Dick Gregory this week. I just want to thank him because of people like him, we're able to sit here today and say the things that we want to say the way that we want to say them.
Yes, sir.
You have to acknowledge the people that come before you. He was a comedian.
Got to know your history.
Right, exactly. Got to know your history. He was a comedian. He was an activist. He always put his money where his mouth was. So we just thank the life. We are thankful for the life of Dick Gregory. We just wanted to acknowledge that. My favorite Dick Gregory story, real quick, is he talks about how they wanted him when he was a comedian, a very popular comedian. They wanted him to be on the Jack Parr show, which was the hottest thing, like Jay Leno or Johnny Carson. And at the time, Black comedians could go on the Jack Parr show. This was in the late 60s, but they couldn't sit on the couch and talk with him afterwards.
Right.
And the condition for him to go on the show was that he gets to have a talk with Jack Parr afterwards on the couch. And that condition was met. And he talked about all the letters he got from white people based on this little 2-minute conversation with Jack Parr, that they didn't realize Black people had families too.
Right.
All the misconceptions that they had about Black people just being exposed in that 2 minutes of national television.
I just in reading about him recently, I read that he wanted to go into politics. Mm-hmm. And he realized that at the time, because of the racial barriers and everything else, that he couldn't. So he had a lifetime devoted to activism. And I really think that's really the biggest lesson of his life, is that if you can't get access down the road that you would prefer, take the road that you can, but you can still make a difference.
Absolutely. Very well said. We're going to leave it right there. We thank everyone for tuning in to Humanity in the Headlines this week. We thank Mr. Breon Jones for producing, again, another excellent show. And as always, we thank Mr. Earl Winfrey.
Mr. Earl Winfrey with that cool jazz play out.
Cool jazz. And
I won't be here for the next 2 Saturdays. For 2 Saturdays.
Oh, goodness. No problem.
But I will see you in September.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching Humanity in the Headlines. You guys have a great weekend.